am compelled to recount an extraordinary experience that occurred to my biological brother before I detail my own encounter, because the two events are profoundly, terrifyingly connected despite being separated by 4 years of time and hundreds of miles of geography. In the summer of 2018, my brother embarked on a solo section hike of the Appalachian Trail through a notoriously rugged, isolated stretch of southwestern Virginia. When he finally returned home from that trip, he was distinctly different. He was noticeably quieter, more withdrawn, and entirely devoid of his usual enthusiasm. This was profoundly out of character for him. He is normally the quintessential outdoor storyteller, the type of guy who returns from a weekend camping trip with 10 hilarious anecdotes that he insists on recounting in vivid detail over family dinner. He came back from this specific trip and maintained a total, brooding silence. Roughly 6 months passed before he finally felt comfortable enough to articulate what had happened to him out on the trail. We were sitting around a campfire in my backyard, and after a few drinks, he finally confessed that on his third night in the Virginia backcountry, he had survived an experience he could not rationally explain. He told me he had been jolted awake in the dead center of the night by a sound originating directly outside his tent. He described it using a phrase that has haunted me ever since. Something was trying to speak. He emphasized that it was definitively not human words or language. It was a sequence of bizarre, wet, guttural vocalizations that possessed the exact rhythm, cadence, inflection, and desperate physical effort of human speech, but it was completely devoid of actual vocabulary or content. It sounded exactly as if a creature that did not possess human vocal cords or a human brain was going through the raw, physical mechanics of mimicking the structural rise and fall of a human conversation without understanding what language actually was. My brother said the horrifying, mindless chatter continued for several minutes right outside his tent wall. A wet, clicking, frantic attempt at speech that almost resolved into words but never did. Finally, the vocalization ceased, and he heard the heavy, bipedal footsteps of the entity step away from his tent and march off into the deep forest. I took his story and filed it away in that dark, isolated corner of my mind reserved for anomalous things you simply do not know what to do with. I assumed it was an isolated incident, perhaps a terrifying encounter with a severely mentally disturbed individual roaming the trail system. 4 years later, in the summer of 2022, I was on a backcountry camping trip in a completely different sector of Western Virginia. The terrain was entirely distinct, dense, old-growth hardwood valleys rather than the high ridge trail my brother had hiked. I was accompanied by 2 close friends, and we had pitched our tents deep within a primitive wilderness zone. On our second night out, I was suddenly jolted completely awake for no identifiable reason. It was that identical experience recounted by so many others, the sudden, instantaneous transition from deep sleep to absolute, hyper-vigilant clarity, signaling that an external threat has bypassed your conscious mind. And then, directly outside my tent, the silence of the valley was broken. I heard the exact same thing my brother had described to me 4 years prior. I knew it instantly with absolute, terrifying certainty. The moment the sound registered in my ears, my brother's exact words flashed through my mind. It was the cadence of human speech without the language. It was a low, wet, clicking, and deeply desperate series of vocalizations that perfectly mimic the natural rise, fall, and pauses of an intense human conversation, yet it contained not a single real word. It was the raw, empty shape of human communication being broadcast by a throat that was profoundly, fundamentally non-human. It stood no more than 10 feet from my nylon tent door. The manifestation lasted for roughly 3 minutes. Then, it stopped abruptly, and I heard the distinct, heavy, bipedal crunch of footsteps walking away from our camp, fading out into the dark timber. The next morning, the moment my 2 friends emerged from their respective tents, they both looked completely pale and shaken. Before I could even speak, They asked me if I had heard the bizarre, terrifying noises outside in the night. They had both been jolted awake by it, but out of absolute terror, they had frozen in their sleeping bags, convincing themselves it must have been a strange animal so they could maintain their sanity. That collective confirmation was deeply significant to me. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that this phenomenon was an absolute reality in the physical world. It was not a psychological delusion, it was not an auditory hallucination, and it was not a product of isolated sleep deprivation. It was a physical entity projecting an acoustic manifestation that was audible to multiple human ears simultaneously. What this entity is, I cannot tell you. Over the years, I have described this specific vocal mimicry to veteran woodsmen, elite trackers, and local hunters who know the Appalachian backcountry intimately. The responses I receive are always cleanly divided into two categories. The first category consists of people who immediately try to rationalize it. They tell me I am simply misidentifying the unusual nocturnal screech of a barn owl, the barking of a red fox, or the mating call of a bobcat. The second category of people react far differently. They do not offer a single alternative explanation. Instead, the moment I describe the cadence of human speech without the words, a specific, chilling look washes over their faces, a look I can only describe as stark, silent recognition. It is the look of someone who has just had a deeply buried, terrifying secret confirmed by an independent witness. They simply nod their heads slowly, look away into the trees, and say, "Yeah." You can see them actively calculating in their minds whether they want to share their own personal account of the voice in the dark, and in almost every instance, they choose to remain silent. They lock it down and walk away. The very moment I cleared the wilderness trailhead of my 2022 trip and re-entered an area with cellular service, the first thing I did was place an urgent phone call to my brother. The moment he answered, I bypassed all casual greetings and told him flatly that I had just heard the exact thing he had encountered in 2018. My brother went completely, utterly silent on the line. The silence lasted for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, his voice came through, cracked, strained, and filled with a resurrected terror. "Did it walk away at the end?" he whispered. I told him yes. It had walked away into the trees after it finished speaking. "Which direction did it go?" he asked. I explained that because of the acoustic echoing of the valley, I couldn't determine the exact compass heading, only that it had marched directly away from the tents into the deep brush. My brother let out a low, shaky breath and told me that on his solo trip 4 years prior, after the entity had finished its mindless mimicry outside his tent, it had turned and marched directly due north, moving further up the spine of the Appalachian Trail. He admitted that he had lain awake for the rest of that night, paralyzed by a horrific, recurring thought that has now become my own daily obsession. He found himself wondering if that entity was systematically walking the mountain trails night after night, moving deliberately from one human outpost to the next, stopping outside every single occupied tent in the dark, practicing its terrifying, hollow imitation of our words on the sleeping inhabitants before marching further into the endless black of the ridges.